On today's show, Karl Anthony-Towns traded to the New York Knicks. How does Cat fit in New York? And does this move put the Knicks on the same tier as the Boston Celtics? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So head on over to FanDuel.com. You can take a look at so many different things like the different season awards, who's going to win which conference, or just the outright Super Bowl favorites. Right now, the Kansas City Chiefs at plus 500 to win it all. Behind them, the 49ers at plus 650, the Ravens at plus 800, the Buffalo Bills at plus 1,000, and then the Houston Texans right there at plus 1,300. So for all those odds and so much more, be sure to visit FanDuel.com. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Knicks, Alex Wolfe. You can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. A blockbuster trade over the weekend in the NBA. The Nova Knicks over before it even began as Julius, Randle, Dante, DiVincenzo, and a future first-round draft pick being shipped out for none other than Karl Anthony-Towns. Alex, this was like the wildest, seemingly kind of out of nowhere trade over the NBA weekend. Let's start with this right here. Why was trading for Cat the right move for New York?
I mean, they're taking a chance on the ideal offense, right? I think that you don't have to look any further than the defending NBA champions to see that 5-out offense is pretty valuable in today's NBA. If you have a player, I mean, they had Porzingis, obviously, and they had Al Horford off the bench and all that. And, shooting bigs are extremely valuable in today's game, especially if you have the right personnel for it. I think the Knicks are just betting on the fact that they have the right personnel. They have Jalen Brunson, who's an offense unto himself, as he showed the last two postseasons where the Knicks just had really bad injury luck the last two postseasons, and he still dragged them to the second round both times, with help from Josh Hart and then obviously Dante DiVincenzo last year and all that. It's not like he did it entirely by himself, but I mean, he's shown that he is a playoff riser. He is, a guy that can get you 40 points in 5 straight playoff games. He's just that good. And so I think what the Knicks are banking on here is one, they were short on center depth after losing Isaiah Hartenstein, thanks to, the early bird rules that didn't allow them to pay as much as they wanted to him. So then they said, okay, well, now we have Mitchell Robinson. Then the news comes out, Mitchell Robinson is going to be out until potentially January. With his injured ankle that he's still rehabbing. And so then you're like, okay, so now the center rotation is Precious Achiuwa and Jericho Sims, which is a little less than ideal. They're fine enough players, especially Precious. I really like him, but really I wouldn't want him to be much more in the backup. And so I think that was part of the impetus for this, but also they've been linked to Cat ever since Leon Rose took over. And I think they probably just took a look at the roster and where they're at right now. And also the fact that they're about to kind of be in cap hell anyway over the next number of years, thanks to this new apron system and everything, and said, you know what, if we're going to take a stab at some dude on a supermax contract that we think could potentially make us a championship contender, now's the time to do it from a nerd perspective, just with the cap, the cap numbers and everything, but also just the basketball fit. You're banking on that shooting and the fact that Cat is just a virtuoso on offense to basically hopefully turn your team into one of the best offenses, if not the best offense in basketball, if it all works out.
Yeah, the offensive side of things seems like almost a perfect fit, right? Cat slots in at the 5 spot. He gives you better spacing for everybody across the roster. Should be, really beneficial for a guy like Jalen Brunson who wants to attack and get downhill, everything like that. But the other side of the coin, right? You got 2 sides of the game. You got to play defense too. How can New York still be an elite defensive team with Cat at the 5 spot?
So I think this also goes back to perfect fit, right? Or perceived perfect fit. where Cat, I'm not a huge believer in him as an anchor of a defense either. I think that I mean, there's literally evidence of Cat as the center on a Tibbs coach team. And he consistently would go away from using Cat at center and would play like his perma best buddy Taj Gibson or whatever, like to be the center in lineups with Cat, because you just can't. He's a little too foul prone. He's not like a super intimidating rim protector like you would necessarily want, especially in a Tibbs defense where you often try to funnel guys into the middle and deal with a troublesome center in the middle. So I think it's going to require a little bit of creative thinking on the part of Tibbs, especially early in the season without Mitch there, where you figure for at least until whenever Mitch comes back, you're going to have Cat probably starting at center. Because I don't think you're really going to be like, oh, let's throw Precious Achiuwa out there to start, because you still need someone to back him up and all that jazz. So, I think what they're really banking on perfect fit wise is saying, okay, well, Cat maybe isn't perfect as the rim protector in this defense, but we now possess two of maybe the top three or four best wing defenders in the entire NBA, in Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby. So you have both those guys that can play fantastic perimeter defense. Perhaps you start Deuce McBride, which would give you a third like lights out perimeter defender, or you bring him in off the bench. Either way, lots of perimeter defense talent on this team. I think what they're banking on is that their perimeter defenders can make life easy enough for Cat on the inside that, maybe they'll go back to, if you remember, like 2 years ago, this past year, they rebounded into being a top 10 defense again. But the last 2 years, they've actually been quite a bit higher ranked in offense than defense. And actually 2 years ago, they were like, I think it was like the 17th defense in the NBA, in defensive rating or something like that. So, this is not a team that the last couple years has really hung their hat on being a primo defense. It's basically just, can they be roughly a top half of the league defense and then be a top three offense and have that propel them into being one of the better teams in the league. So I think that's probably their plan. I think their plan is like, we're going to be one of, if not the best offense in the league. And if we can even sniff being a top 10 defense, then that's a finals contender right there, I think, because that offense is going to just be so good.
So obviously you don't get a guy like a Karl Anthony-Towns without giving up significant value in return. So that the outgoing pieces of this trade for the Knicks, obviously Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, and that future first round pick. Now, obviously there was some speculation, some, thoughts about, okay, well, do the Knicks really need Randle to be successful given, their level of success without him, especially this past season. So, that's kind of one thing. But then Dante DiVincenzo, I feel like, is a really underrated part of this trade, which kind of feels like he was like the almost the crown jewel of this trade in return for the Timberwolves in order to get Cat. How do you feel about just kind of the value of this trade? And, did the Knicks get enough value, or I guess who was the winner, who was the loser in this trade in your eyes? And is there a concern now that the Knicks are maybe, not even maybe, quite a bit more top heavy than they were before, a team that had a lot of depth? They've lost some of their depth now.
Yeah, they definitely lost some depth. I mean, Dante DiVincenzo was going to be their seventh man this year, like co-sixth man, which is crazy considering he was, I cite this stat all the time, or I did, now I don't get to anymore, that he was he was the third ranked guy in attempts and third ranked guy in makes from three last year, behind only Steph and Luka.
It's okay. We'll pass that stat along to Locked On Wolves, and Ben can use it,
right. I'm talking to him after this, and I'll be sure to pass that along so he knows, but he could bring it up all the time. But he was a prolific 3-point shooter last year and just did it on crazy volume, set the Knicks single game record for threes, set the Knicks single season record for threes all at once. Just a crazy, crazy season for him. And, it sucks to lose him, honestly. I wish, from a value perspective, to answer that part, I really wish that the Knicks hadn't also given up the first round pick. I think that pick is sort of a Mickey Mouse pick, if I'm being honest. It's a very heavily protected Detroit first round pick. I think there's a solid chance, unless Tobias Harris is the answer there, that, it probably doesn't convey as a first and just ultimately turns into a second in 2 years. But either way, I felt like because the Knicks were giving up Dante in addition to Randle, I would have liked to see the Knicks get a pick back, if anything, in this deal, because I think Dante, if you just offered him up to any team around the league, could fetch you at least a first round pick. He's that good of a 3-point shooter. He's the type of guy that every team would want. But I will push back a little bit on the Randle front. Like I think that he's being undervalued. And the narrative that the Knicks got better once he got hurt or whatever, I think is not a thing. That's just not a thing. They were once they got OG Anunoby, they were 14-2. Once Anunoby joined the lineup with Randle, with Brunson, with DiVincenzo, with everybody, they were 14-2. I mean, they were insanely good. And once Randle went down, they went through some rough patches while they were absorbing the loss of losing him, as well as OG Anunoby, but also Julius Randle. I mean, he's a 2-time All-NBA guy in the last 4 seasons, potentially could have been 3-time All-NBA this past season if he kept going at the rate he was going. He's a 3-time All-Star. I mean, the guy he's really, really good. I don't think there's any world where like the Knicks would have been like, oh yeah, like getting rid of him is like addition by subtraction. I don't think that's the case. They did well to give themselves auxiliary depth this year all the way out to the 15th man, but it still hurts nonetheless to lose a guy as good as Dante DiVincenzo, who could have come off the bench.
How will Karl Anthony-Towns look as a member of the New York Knicks? Does this move put them on the same tier as the Boston Celtics? You can have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Knicks. Alex, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Of course, always happy to be here.